our PowerPoint, please? Thank you. Okay, assuming y'all can see my our PowerPoint. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the nuts and bolts of trauma-informed victims' rights lawyering. This session is presented by Lotus Legal Clinic and Wisconsin Judicare. You'll be able to find materials for our session in the Whova app. You can also answer our poll question in the Whova app. We'll be talking about answers to this poll later in the session. Please put any questions that you have for us in the Q&A feature, and we'll answer those at the end of the presentation. Thank you again for joining us this morning. Okay. So I want to first have Abai introduce herself, please.
Thank you, Megan. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Abai Medrano. I am the bilingual paralegal for Lotus Legal Clinic. Prior to my role as a paralegal, I worked with the Milwaukee County District Attorney's Office in their victim witness program. I graduated from Mount Mary University with a degree in justice and Spanish, and I'm currently pursuing or furthering my education in legal studies. And without further ado, I will have Attorney Erica Petty introduce herself. Thank you.
Thank you, Abby. Good morning, everyone. My name is Erica Petty. I am the Executive Director currently at Lotus Legal Clinic. Before being Executive Director, I was a staff attorney there for the last 6 years. My experience at Lotus has been representing victims of sexual violence and human trafficking, with victims' rights enforcement, and also some other civil legal needs that survivors need following a victimization. Prior to Lotus Legal Clinic, I was a staff attorney at Legal Action of Wisconsin for over 9 years. So thank you for having us. I will turn it over to Megan.
Hi, I'm Megan Lee. I am a staff attorney at Wisconsin Judicare in our Victims' Rights Project and Family Law Unit. I have been at Judicare since 2019, representing mostly victims of sexual assault and domestic violence. So I'll turn back to Abai to start us off with more information about Lotus Legal Clinic.
Thank you, Megan. So who are we? So Lotus Legal Clinic is a nonprofit organization that serves victims of sexual violence and both sex and labor trafficking through trauma-informed legal services, policy, education, and survivor empowerment. We provide free legal services to victims of all forms of trafficking, regardless of gender identity, immigration status, ability, age, race, and ethnicity. And we are statewide. Next slide, please.
So we're just going to go through a little bit of our objectives for today. We are going to start talking about what trauma is, defining trauma, how Lotus and Judicare serve survivor clients from marginalized communities by utilizing trauma-informed advocacy. We are going to talk about how trauma manifests in ourselves as trauma workers, also known as vicarious trauma or trauma response, trauma exposure response, as that's very important to our work as lawyers who work with survivors. And then through that part, and then Megan will talk about strategies for collaborating with system partners and really getting into kind of the nuts and bolts of representing survivors who have victims' rights needs. So we hope that this will be a fruitful webinar this morning and that everyone has had their coffee. Thank you.
So before I get started to talk about trauma, I just want to make a disclaimer that we are not mental health practitioners. We do not diagnose anyone when they call our organization. We do work with counselors throughout the state. Also, the information that you'll be receiving, it's from experience with working with survivors and also the trainings that I have attended in the past. So let's begin with defining trauma. the American Psychological Association defines it as an emotional response to a terrible event like an accident, rape, or a natural disaster. Everyone has experienced trauma at one point in their life, and we will go into details in regards to the different types of trauma.
Another definition of trauma is here on this page, and it's defined by John Allen, and I thought it was helpful because it kind of breaks down the different ways that I think people respond to trauma, and that trauma can be described as an individual experience of an event. And then Abby later will talk about other types of trauma, but in this though, objectively, trauma can pose a threat to the physical or psychological integrity of someone. And then we can think about trauma subjectively as well, where we're experiencing the actual emotional response and how that can be somewhat different. And we have feelings of terror or rage, sometimes humiliation or shame. And that is all part of a trauma response and what trauma is. And so I like this definition a little bit more than kind of the classic, like, acute response to something that's terrible, because trauma can be experienced a lot more internally as well. And so there's Dr. Allen gives examples of, accidents, other disasters, but also like long-term trauma, like trauma, domestic violence and witnessing domestic violence, childhood sexual abuse and neglect, and how those are all different and carry with it different layers of trauma. And the next slide that Abby will talk about will go into kind of the different traumas that people can experience throughout their lifetime.
Yeah, so there are several types of trauma, like Erica mentioned, acute, chronic trauma, which is experiences that occur, that are reoccurring and prolonged, such as like a long-term illness. Complex trauma is an exposure to multiple traumatic events from an early age. And as Erica mentioned, for example, it would be emotional, physical, or sexual abuse or witnessing domestic violence within the caregiving system. Historical and racial trauma, that is increasing trauma experience by a group across generations that are still suffering the effects and current experiences. So examples of racial trauma would be, systematic oppression, violence against BIPOC, and BIPOC is, it's defined as, or it stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. And some of the reactions of trauma, as you may know, are fear, guilt, difficulty expressing feelings, confusion, shame, mistrust in others. So it's very important that when we are working with survivors, we take into consideration how we are interacting with them. Next slide, please. So implementing trauma approach in our work is crucial because it provides, implementing trauma approach in your work is not only how we interact with the individual, but providing them with different principles. For example, empowering the survivor, respecting them, being transparent throughout the process with them. And many survivors have experienced abuse of autonomy and personal boundaries. So it's crucial that we provide a safe environment for them. And I believe that being transparent will lead to a higher trust for our clients. And client collaboration is also crucial in this process of being trauma-informed care, providing the feedback for our clients and being able to ask our clients what they want to see throughout the process. So when working with survivors, I I believe in being flexible and accessible to them. So when we are communicating with them, letting them know what the discussion or the interview will be about, or the phone call, giving them the choice if they want to meet in person via Zoom, or if they would like to schedule like a phone appointment, being accommodating. If there is a language barrier, being able to provide those services for them. Just being mindful of our biases and respecting their differences, and being aware of other people's culture as well. With survivors, as many know, that trauma impacts their memory. Sometimes when speaking with a survivor during an interview, or just gathering some general information, they might not remember the exact details or dates from their victimization. So it's okay for us to be honest and let them know that if they don't remember something, we can always come back at a later time to discuss that topic. And you might experience a lot of inconsistencies when you do work with survivors, but it's okay to let them know that during your session, meaning the interview or the phone call, just to let them know what to expect. A lot of the survivors, a lot of the questions that we ask during screening or intake or interview sessions is very triggering to the individual. Next slide. At Lotus, we believe in being culturally humble. And as Trevelyan and Garcia define cultural humility, is the lifelong process of self-evaluation and self-critique, whereby the individual not only learns about another culture, but you start with examination of your own beliefs and culture identities. In regards to being culturally humble, that helps us to not only ask ourselves about our culture, but also being mindful about how we interact and frame questions with respect to race, genders, sexuality, religion, and other identities. In regards, next slide, please. So how to be, or how to practice cultural humility. Be clear with who you are and be able to respect the survivors' cultural differences. Be self-aware of your own biases and misconceptions. With regards to our screening process, we do our best to be use trauma-sensitive language, use phone etiquette. For example, if we are calling a client to do an intake, we let them know that we will be taking notes. They might hear that we will pause for a minute because we're taking notes or typing, just letting them, making them aware of what we're doing. Sometimes the individual might be triggered or might feel that we are not listening to them. Try to build a conversation or build rapport before you ask specific questions. And definitely let the survivor know if they are, or ask the survivor if they are working with an advocate or a social worker or a counselor. Just trying to make being able to have the survivor feel more comfortable in regards to the situation or our interview process. And then allow the client to process information as well. During our intake process, if the survivor is working with a social worker, we will ask for consent before we communicate with anyone else, and we'll gather that information from them. our main purpose is not to re-traumatize the survivor. So we try our best to communicate with with their advocate or social worker or counselor before gathering that information. Once that information or the preliminary information is gathered, we will review it in an upcoming legal department meeting to discuss the survivor's case. If we decide as a group that we are able to assist this individual, then an attorney will be assigned to the survivor. And then if it's something that we are not able to handle, we will definitely provide additional referrals for that individual to seek.
Thank you, Abai. And one of the things we just wanted to talk about regarding the intake process and working with survivors at this point in our webinar is to just really kind of talk about the importance of explaining to our clients what privacy is, what confidentiality is, and what privilege is, and kind of what information does a victim or a survivor have control over, what they don't have control over when making decisions to disclose their experience, their victimization to law enforcement, to make that initial disclosure. What does that mean? What does it mean when you're working with an attorney? So that attorney-client relationship and how those communications are protected and how the survivor controls that relationship. So we feel like it's very important at the beginning of our relationship with who we're working with that we're explaining all of the different laws and rules that shape communication and disclosures and shape the survivor's story, basically. Hopefully that at the beginning, that is a way that we can try to build trust right away, is to be very open about the risks and the positives of reporting, disclosing, and how all of those different flows of information work. So we just thought it was important to raise that here. I know Megan will talk more about it in her session too, or her part of this session as well. So next slide, please. Okay. What is trauma-informed lawyering? Well, I think first and foremost, it is a process. I think we're always changing and adapting to new understandings of working with people that are trauma affected. And then us as trauma workers or people that work with trauma affected people, always kind of learning and experience how this trauma contributes to our own work and understanding of trauma, even within ourselves as practitioners. And as I talk more about this, I do feel like that's very important to us as practitioners, as lawyers, as legal professionals, to always be thinking about how our clients' trauma affects us. And one of the things I wanted to share here was a definition that is presented. She's a legal professor, and she wrote a paper called The Pedagogy of Trauma-Informed Lawyering. And the definition that I think has been around for a while is trauma-informed lawyering means putting the realities of clients' trauma experiences at the forefront and adjusting the practice approach as informed by the client's lived experiences. So we're looking at and having that initial conversation with someone, being very mindful of that person's experience and that person's own trauma. And I think what we're realizing now more, and maybe it's because of coming out of 2020 and the pandemic, but also Black Lives Matter movement, is that there are more and more practitioners talking about and being mindful of racial trauma and intersectional oppression that could be impacting our clients and do impact our clients, and how we need to be and can be very aware of that. Because I think what we need to, at least for me, understanding that as a lawyer, I represent some of these same institutions and systems that have caused trauma to our clients. And so being aware of that, I think, is very helpful in building rapport with our clients that have layers of trauma. that, you know, in some ways looking at myself and looking at what I do, maybe there's a barrier there as well, and acknowledging that. So I think this is a movement that's kind of just getting started, and over the last few years about really talking about racial and other oppressive traumas that individuals share, not only BIPOC community, but LGBTQ and other communities of people where there are barriers and probably feelings of harm that have occurred when trying to report crime, and the responses that people can get from the systems that we work within. So next slide, please. The next part of this session, we'll talk about our trauma exposure response. Another word for that is vicarious trauma. And one of the books that I've recommended, and I think I put it in the Whova app, is called Trauma Stewardship, an everyday guide to caring for self while caring for others. I found this book to be very insightful as someone that, you know, has worked with trauma affected people for many years, and really starting to dig into how that might affect myself, my work, and also my personal life. And the author, Laura Van Dernick-Lipsky, she's the first time that I've heard the word trauma worker as a term that is used for so many different professionals that work with people that have been trauma affected. And that includes lawyers and social workers and first responders, all sorts of professionals who intersect with people and are helping in the helping professions, really. Laura herself was an emergency room social worker, a community organizer, an immigrant and refugee advocate, and an educator. So this book kind of grew out of her own experience over decades of working with and being exposed to other people's trauma. And this definition of trauma exposure response, I'll read it, but I think it's a good place to start, is a trauma exposure response has occurred when external traumas become an internal reality. So we're feeling that in the trauma of our clients internally. When this happens as a result of our work, it can catch us off guard. Indeed, the thought that pain around us can actually change our own psychological and physiological responses, altering our worldview, may never have occurred to us. We often assume that our very status as helpers grants us immunity from the suffering we witness, and we are often wrong. So I think this spoke to me as a definition of vicarious trauma that I can identify with. And then we can go to the next slide and kind of talk about how there are certain experiences when we do confront trauma and have a trauma response that could potentially impact our work or impact our lives outside of work. I think that this is, and I know we set up a poll in Whova, so we're hoping that people are able to participate in that, so that actually we could maybe talk when we're done with our presentation. We would like to open it up and talk to everyone that's a part of this webinar about responses people may have that are working for them in helping them get through their trauma exposures. And some of the things that I wanted to highlight within this wheel, that I think I've seen in my own work over time, is in how trauma exposures affect myself, is this kind of like hyper vigilance and always being very serious, hard to turn off when I'm working from home. I think the pandemic has exacerbated some of our own trauma responses working with survivors. Because there are times, I think, where you're listening to someone's story or trying to work with a survivor on getting facts for something, either a motion or a declaration for their immigration applications, and you're listening to things that are hard to hear, that are, even though you might have your lawyer brain on and you're thinking, well, I'm getting to A, B, C, and D here, but you're still being affected by what your client is saying. And then you tag on to that you may be doing this at home alone, with no coworkers around or other people that you can build support with. And I think that that has exasperated some of our own vicarious trauma over the pandemic. And I think it's worth acknowledging that, and at least within myself too, and looking at ways to find healthy responses to that. I think, when you're working from home, it's hard to turn off your cell phone or always looking at your work email and things like that. And I think the question is, how long can we do that and sustain that? How can that really be sustaining to our work? I think another response that we have to think about is when we are very tired and there's some chronic fatigue and having less energy, is that we may have a diminished capacity to think creatively, to think about solutions for our clients we're thinking outside the box, and we're thinking about ways to help our clients. Well, if we're overwhelmed with our own trauma responses, that's going to affect how we can respond to our clients in the best way. And so I think that can happen, and that creeps into our work. And I think it gets us into these cycles of, well, this is how I always do an intake. This is how I always start it. This is all the questions I ask. And maybe part of that is because of, just being the creativity and is diminished a little bit. And like, it is comfortable to say, this is how I start each intake. It's comfortable. It feels right. But maybe I need to shift my approach. And do I see that? Am I in a state where I can actually understand that when I'm talking to an individual, that I do need to shift the way that I am approaching this intake? Maybe it's in a different room. Maybe I need to be offering more support for this client. And so am I in a space to see that or not? I think the other I don't know how to say this. One of these other responses to trauma that I think, when I was reading this book, Trauma Stewardship, there's lots of quotes. There's lots of stories from workers that give their experience about how they dealt with their own trauma responses. And one of the quotes actually really spoke to me. And it's, again, talking about the feeling of being overwhelmed, feeling that you can't ever do enough. And this is the quote. I'll just read it and then we can talk about it. It says, the quote is, "It's not a feeling that's true. It's not a feeling, it's true. If I don't do it, it's not going to get done. And if it doesn't get done, people will die. I can never do enough." Attorney, and this was an attorney for inmates sentenced to capital punishment. So I think, not all of us do that work, but we do work, I think, where we think that if I don't keep doing this, if I don't, if I take 5 minutes away, or I take a day off, or I choose to go on vacation, things are not going to get done and people are going to suffer. And so I think that that's another thing to think about, and how we structure our work, how we collaborate with other people that we work with so that we can take those breaks and can take those vacations that are needed. And just looking internally at our organizations to look at how we can set up systems of support. So we can go to the next slide, because now we can talk about positive, how trauma stewardship, how we take care of ourselves, knowing that we might have exposures to some of these responses to trauma that we looked at in the previous slide. The importance of trauma stewardship. And for me, that means, how do we build our self-resiliency so that we can sustain our work, the work that we love to do, or work that gives us, a sense of meaning. It's something that we want to continue to do. Then we have to take care of ourselves. And also, what's very important is that we can be our best versions for our clients, because they deserve the best version of ourselves. So I think knowing that, and knowing that we strive to be that best version of ourselves, we have to look at ways and look for tools that we can use when we are feeling like we're not our best selves, and that we've had a hard day, or we've had a hard week, or even longer. And looking at ways that we can address those. And I think that another part of our work as legal professionals, I think, is that oftentimes, like through our career or through our education, we're often rewarded when we deny or displace our feelings. And maybe even the response of not acknowledging our feelings, or that we're, really struggling, is that it may serve the institutions that we're a part of, right? That we're not supposed to talk about these things. We're supposed to be, the lawyers that are helping our clients, and we know all things, and that's just not true. And so I think it's the questions we have to be asking ourselves is, how is this working for my truest self? How is this working for those that I serve? And is this sustainable? And when it's not, then we look at these tools. And I think quickly, I'll just kind of go through, and again, this is all kind of talked about in this book as well, but having personal control, capacity to control one's own life, and knowing that you've got choices too, that you don't need to be feeling down and feeling overwhelmed. There's ways to get out of that, and really looking at your own self and self-inquiry around that. The next is pursuing personal, meaningful tasks, pursuing personal things that are not connected to your work. Is very important. And then I think that dovetails into just healthy lifestyle choices, which is easier said than done, I think. But I think it's important. I value that. And maybe it's not exercise or anything like that, but meditation, or some part of your day or week where you've set aside time to relax, and whatever that means for each of us as individuals. And then I think the last one is something that I personally have tend to ignore, I think. But in the recent years, I've found this much more helpful, is building a support system, either social support or community support, being involved in a group that you feel comfortable with and can share things that are outside of work. But also, I do truly believe too that having colleagues that you're working with that support you is so very important as well. Because again, I think this work can be isolating at times, and knowing that you've got people around you that understand your work, and can support you and give you positive vibes, is great, is important, and helps us all sustain our work together. And I liked this quote that I found too, that empathy without boundaries is self-destruction. So, part of trauma stewardship is also like, being able to see when you are breaking down boundaries that might not be healthy for you. And I think we can all do that as being people that want to help and being in a helping profession. But knowing that we do need to be mindful of boundaries and putting those in place so that we can be healthy and be the best version of ourselves. Okay, next slide. So with all of that in mind, and being aware of trauma that our clients face, and then our own unique responses to trauma, and maybe even trauma that we ourselves have, how do we adapt that, and how do we approach our practice? And Megan will talk about a lot of this as well, but I just thought I'd quickly go through some of the pieces pulling out from what we just talked about being trauma informed. And that is to be present with our clients, being able to just be there, being able to see signs when maybe the approach we're taking with someone isn't working, being patient and empathetic, ensuring that there's privacy, again, kind of what I talked about before, of informing survivors about the information and the disclosures, and being transparent, right? Just being I mean, there are not over-promising, setting expectations. Again, this will be things that we talk about later. And then explaining everything before we do something. So and this goes into the last part with being collaborative with our clients, knowing that they have a part in what we do, explaining everything, and having them being totally informed every step of the way is important, and it helps build that trust. And then again, being creative would be the last piece. So I think that's it.
Thank you, Erica. And before we turn it over to Megan, we would like to share a story with you from a survivor that has worked with Lotus Legal Clinic. And before I read the story, I just wanted to give you a little bit more feedback about our survivor empowerment program that we have at Lotus. So we develop a two-sister art education programs, Untold Stories and Rise and Thrive. The goal is to engage, empower, and heal survivors through the practice of literary art, and through a unique collaboration with local artists working in the community. So this is a story from our magazine that was published last year, and it's called Out by Abby Brooks. And it reads, I did my best to be cooperative and respectful. Did I do my part speaking, or did I sound too resentful? Outside, I saw sunshine, a warm summer day. Hearing a knock on the hotel room door, I was not sure who it could be. I thought to myself, this could be it. They are here to save me. When instead of search for cash, pulling apart dressers, closets, and my personal belongings without asking how I was feeling, letting him in, I felt invaded. Withdrawn, worthless, paralyzed. I explained to him that I had nothing. My income had been taken. Caught in the net of trauma, I was left to struggle in silence. Maybe he thought I would prefer it that way. I'm sure he had much more important things going on that day. It may have been me who was young and impressionable, but his intentions were bold, dark, and deeply rooted. This man diluted the confidence and spark I once had. This man and a few others put me in a train, destination unknown, brought me back into a life of isolation, deprivation, abuse. I thought to myself, there has to be a way out. Thank you.
Thank you both. I want to turn to talk a little bit more about kind of collaborating to provide trauma-informed legal representation for victims. And as I tell my clients, I use the term victim because that's the legal term. And I always leave the option open for my clients to let me know if they would prefer a different term, but I'm going to continue to use the word victim just because that's the legal term. So any time that I'm representing a victim of crime, the goals of representation throughout the criminal court process are really kind of four main areas to help advocate for them, which is really any attorney-client relationship. Our goal is to advocate for our clients. But what I always tell, especially victims of crime, is that, you know, I am there to help them accomplish their goals using the law, but it's not my position. It's not my job to tell them what to do, and I'm not going to do that because I really want to help empower them to regain some of that autonomy that they have lost. So the way that I often do that is through enforcing their rights, specifically their legal rights under Chapter 950 in the Wisconsin statutes and under the Wisconsin Constitution, Article 1, Section 9M. So again, just really empowering them. The criminal process is incredibly traumatizing for victims. So making sure that they have as much control as possible in a situation where they have very little. So making sure that their voice is heard, that they understand that as their attorney, I am solely in their corner. I have no other interest in the case. I'm not prosecuting the case. I care about the case insofar as my client does, but it is not my responsibility to prosecute the case. I want them to understand their options, but I don't want them to feel like I'm telling them to do a certain thing. I just want to be there to help give them their options, make sure that they are as informed as possible and be able to make the best decision for them. And then also trying to help them heal through this process. I think one of the big steps or strategies for that is really helping them have their voice. It can be incredibly healing for victims of crime to feel heard, to speak up, especially, through a victim impact statement, making sure that the judge is only hearing from them. They're able to talk directly to the judge. It's not filtered through the DA's office. It's not filtered through me. It is their chance to really make sure that what this crime has done to their lives is heard and understood by everybody in the process, and also to help heal them through, connecting them with resources and support. So a few strategies when dealing with a victim of crime. I really think it's important to kind of think about what Abby and Erica talked about, the idea that trauma manifests in so many different ways, and it can have, impacts on memory. It can have impacts on how, someone lives their day-to-day life. It's so varied. So it's so important to recognize how trauma can be impactful, and also, what types of trauma a client can have. It can be trauma from this crime, definitely, but it could also be racial trauma or other oppression that has caused trauma in their lives. So being cognizant of that and really adjusting to better serve the client through communication, trust, and collaboration. So starting with communication, the big areas are to really be open, to make sure your communication is customized to that individual client, really to be patient, and to practice active listening. So being open when communicating with a victim of crime is really about creating a safe space for them. So asking open and non-judgmental questions. I always avoid asking why questions without giving context or just at all. I think a lot of times working, especially with victims of sexual assault and domestic violence, there is the societal judgment that comes through of, why did you wear this? Why did you go with this person? Why did you stay with them for so long? That it is why comes with a lot of weight there, a lot of baggage of being a very judgmental question that can make a client defensive and make it difficult to really establish trust. So I do try to avoid those questions as much as possible. Instead, maybe asking, how they felt about the situation, what support they need to avoid feeling like that, trying to make it clear that you're just trying to understand the situation. I do sometimes ask why questions in the context of, this is something you could be asked in court. And rather than you hearing this for the first time in court, I want to kind of have that happen in a safe space. So having that context there, so it's not me questioning, well, why did you do this? Or, why in a judgmental way. It's more of, this could come up. I want you to be prepared. So really just creating a safe environment for them so that they can share their struggles and really their needs with you and utilize you in whatever way possible as their attorney. So I think it's also important really to have a customized communication for each individual client, and recognizing that what works for one client might not work for the next client. And the biggest thing is, if you don't know, or if you're not sure what's working, ask your client. That goes a long way to letting them know, I want to be able to help you in whatever way possible. And I want to, get your input on what's going to work for you. So, really understanding their lived experiences and how that can impact what is comfortable for them, and really being flexible in your response when working with them. So, they might be on a different sleep schedule. Afternoons might work better for them. Mornings might work better for them. Sometimes I have clients that, they have a hard time processing information if we're just talking on the phone. So what's helpful for them is really to follow up with a text or an email to kind of summarize what we talked about. That gives them time to process and follow up with questions that they just can't think of when we're talking on the phone. So really customizing your communication to each individual client and being flexible with their needs. And then also understanding that patience is a virtue. It really is, especially with a victim of crime, they might they might have had some negative experiences within the criminal system. So feeling like they're being dismissed, no one's really hearing them, no one's really listening to them. You don't want to be another person who doesn't really listen to them. So take the time to let them share their story if they want to. Recognize that they might need space to talk about it. They might not want to talk about it, but really just being patient to develop that relationship with the client and develop that trust, and really working to accommodate their needs. So, it also could come about, not remembering that they have paperwork to fill out, or, being depressed or having struggles doing day-to-day tasks that they, are not going to remember what their lawyer needs. So understanding that you may need to remind them or may need to be patient with that. I think active listening is also an incredibly important practice to work on. I think Abby mentioned a really good strategy of, letting them know that if I'm quiet, or if you hear typing, I'm taking notes. I'm not ignoring you. I'm not, I haven't stopped listening. I'm just taking notes and processing what you're talking about. But make sure that, your client is understanding where you're coming from. Make sure your client understands that you're listening to them, you're hearing them, so that can come through restating what you've heard so far, summarizing it to make sure that you understand what they've said to you, and that they know that you've been listening, really validating their experiences and their feelings. I can understand why you're frustrated with this. I appreciate your willingness to be open with me, just letting them know that you're there with them. And then keeping the conversation moving, keeping it open-ended, like, oh, okay, then what happened? Just letting them kind of guide the conversation, acknowledging their emotions and giving them space to feel that. So, if they're crying, let them know that you're here if they want to talk, but, they can take a moment, really redirecting the conversation when needed. So acknowledging that, I understand why you're frustrated. I do want to ask a few questions that we need to cover during this meeting, and then we can kind of get back to what we were talking about, but really keeping it focused on them, and doing that through eliminating distractions. Don't have your phone with you, don't have your email up in the background, really letting them know that you are there with them, that you want to talk with them, and that, you're focused directly on them. A lot of that is also really important to helping to build trust. I think that transparency is really one of the biggest things that we can do to help build trust, because sugarcoating things or setting essentially false expectations and letting them down later is really a hurtful thing for a victim of crime. So letting them know, this is when we're going to be talking about your trauma, or we don't need to talk about it because I've seen the criminal complaint, but if you want to talk about it, you can. Being open and honest with them about what a meeting is about, letting them know that if you're bringing up something difficult, that I don't want you to hear this for the first time in the courtroom, things along those lines. And really managing expectations, be realistic about what they can expect from you. So, don't say, I'm going to respond today, and knowing full well that you have meetings all afternoon, you probably will forget about it. Just being realistic, managing expectations so that they are not disappointed, and they are not let down by you. So really setting those clear expectations, following through on promises so that they know what to expect from you, and then also being clear about your role so that they know what you expect from them. How are you going to work together? How are you collaborating on their case? And really just being clear, even starting in the representation agreement, about what you're helping them with. If you're representing them in the criminal case, is this through restitution? Is this going to be in collecting restitution? How far does this go? So that they really have an understanding of what the relationship is, and that it's, maybe if there is a need for a restraining order, that would be something separate, and just, again, being clear in the representation agreement. So I think the other really important thing is collaborating, and I'll talk a little bit more about specific system partners, but I think what's important and maybe sometimes hard for lawyers is recognizing that we have limitations. We cannot do everything. That's just not realistic. I often let clients know that too, that even if I can't do something, I will try to connect them to the resources or the person who could help them with that, especially knowing that I am not a therapist. I have, the ability to be an empathetic and compassionate listener with my clients, but that has limits. I'm not a mental health professional, so recognizing that and making sure to connect clients with the right resources. I think that either connecting them with resources or making referrals, the biggest kind of most important thing is getting the client input on that and having their informed consent. So thinking about, oh, if you're open or interested in these options, here are some options for you to consider, not, well, you need to go to a therapist because, oof, you're having a really tough time. Like, yes, you are having a really tough time, but, something that could be helpful, switching the conversation so it's their decision, and making sure that if that's something they're interested, that you're able to help them get those resources. So I think about, victim witness a lot of the time, or community advocates. They have wonderful connections to, if there's mental health treatment resources, support groups, various, even if it's, something, so, your client is struggling to find housing or employment, really thinking of outside the box of trying to get them connected with the right resources. And anytime that I'm making a direct referral on behalf of a client to an agency, always getting their informed consent so they understand that I'm making the referral, but also what information I'm disclosing as part of the referral. And then if my client wants me to talk to that referring agency more about their case, getting a release of information. So again, that client is consenting and aware of what I will be sharing and is comfortable with what I'm sharing and understands the implications of that. So a little bit more about the system partners, thinking about really the state. So the DA's office, especially victim witness, I think that the way that the DA's offices tend to be set up is that victim witness tends to be the most direct and most common source of contact and information for a victim, and honestly the most common a person that I work with within the system, within the district attorney's office. They are wonderful at identifying resources and making referrals, setting up meetings with the DA, really keeping you in the victim in the loop on the case and what's going on and if there's other resources. But I tend to try to kind of early on in the representation, beyond the notice of retainer, sending a letter, sending an email, depending on my relationship with the victim witness office, letting them know, I've been retained on the case. You can contact me with questions. You can contact me, trying to let them know if, please do continue to send notices to my client. Just copy me on those communications, or my client would prefer that you just send them to me. So letting them know what they can do as far as their notice requirements under the statutes. And then also just letting them know, do you want to be updated on the case? Do you want to receive copies of every email? They've also been really helpful too for having difficulties getting documents and things like that. Getting connected with victim witness is a wonderful way to really just get tapped into the case, and also letting them know, and I tend to copy or have it also be directed to the district attorney assigned to the case, but letting them know my role. Victims' rights attorneys are not prosecutors. That's not my purpose. That I cannot do that. I don't want to do that, to be honest, but I am there to really help advocate on behalf of the victim's interests. Sometimes that might be aligned with the state, sometimes not. And that, for me, that doesn't matter at the end of the day. What matters is what my client wants. So that's why we're there to help accomplish that through the law, using the legal means available, and then also making sure that we're kind of keeping in the loop the state or whoever is involved there. And then also using community organizations to, again, getting the client set up with support groups or other resources to help support their non-legal needs as far as, housing, mental health, employment. Sometimes even just having somebody, having yet another person sitting with them at hearings can be incredibly helpful. So again, letting it be driven by the client and what their needs are. So again, anytime that I'm communicating with an outside agency about my client, getting a release of information for the DA's office and victim witness, for any community advocate or agency, so that the client understands what the extent of that release is, what I can talk about with that agent or that system partner, and just has it be clear what the expectations are in that release of information. But then turning to the court, really being able to effectively advocate for my clients comes in through e-filing and being able to see the documents that have been filed in the case. That has become a lot easier since the amendment was passed to the Constitution. It tends to happen in a couple of different ways, but either just filing a notice of retainer as a non-party e-filing, and then the court waiting for the court to add the victim's initials as a party, and then so you can opt into e-filing. Or sometimes I'll call the court ahead of time to ask that they add the initials so that I can just opt in and file my notice of retainer at the same time. It just depends. I also try to work with, again, victim witness, but also court staff to make sure that my client feels safe at hearings if they're going in person. If there's anything that they need to be aware of, knowing that they can check in with victim witness will go over with them, or if they're bringing an advocate, if they want to be heard at the hearing, making sure that victim witness knows so that they can communicate that with the DA. And then also thinking about something that has really come up as part of the, out of the pandemic is the availability of remote hearings. So there's a form, the request to appear remotely. It is GF 306. But that form is really intended to kind of be an easy way for you to request on behalf of the victim, either for a particular hearing or for all of the hearings, except obviously, they can't just testify at trial by filing this, but, leading up to all these hearings, if a victim wants to be involved in the process, but, maybe they live on the other side of the state, or, having to leave work is a burden for them, or, getting childcare, that they can just virtually attend, listen in on what's going on, and then get back to their day. So having that as an option, knowing that that's an option to request on behalf of the victim is really important. Also, I tend to file other things that are, motions or requests that I draft individually, but if a victim is unrepresented, there is a request for enforcement of victims' rights form. It is CF 296, and that allows a victim to file basically a standardized court form of, letting the court know that I am having issues with one of my rights as a crime victim. I need the court's help in getting these rights enforced. The biggest thing that I recommend communicating to victims with that form is that it is going to be part of the public record unless you request that it be sealed, and it is successfully sealed. So being careful about what you disclose in that form and recognizing that the defense could see it, the defendant can see it. So being cognizant of what's in the form, and not disclosing too much, especially not disclosing much about the crime, if at all. And then just victims' attorneys, though I am a victim attorney, just recognizing that we do exist. We can help victims. We are not there to try to make anyone's job difficult. Our position is really to make sure that the victim's rights are enforced, that their voice can be heard. The difficulty is that victim witness, DA, you can't give a victim legal advice. That is something you can't do. So if that's something the victim needs, you can refer to a victim attorney. Or even if you're interested in representing victims, there's a growing group in Wisconsin of attorneys who are dedicated to advocating for victims in criminal cases. So we would love to see that group continue to grow. We would welcome you in that group. But the only thing I would say, that if you're going to refer a victim to a victim's attorney, to think about making sure you're getting informed consent before you do that. So a little bit about Judicare's referral process and eligibility is that basically our Victims' Rights Project is a statewide project in collaboration with Legal Action of Wisconsin to represent victims of crime. It is typically interpersonal crime that isn't a requirement, but it does tend to be in that realm. And really any assistance with their rights as a crime victim. It typically is privacy rights, so requests for mental health records, school records, things of that nature. But it can include other enforcement of their rights, if it's help filing a complaint with the Crime Victims' Rights Board, or getting, help with their victim impact statement, really anything that they might need help with throughout the criminal process. That is something that we could potentially help with in part of our project. So we don't have any income or asset limits, which is different from Judicare's typical eligibility requirements. And people, and by people I mean victims, can apply through our typical online intake or over the phone. But we often do see referrals from outside agencies, whether that's a DVSA agency, victim witness, DOJ sometimes refers to our project. That is something we do have a referral form for. So if you're interested in that, you can definitely contact me. And then I want to hear a little bit more about Lotus's referral process too. Erica or Behi can talk about that.
Thank you, Megan. Yes, so if you have a question regarding, if you're unsure if your client meets our eligibility requirements, you are always welcome to give us a call. Our information will be at the end of the presentation, and the presentation will be uploaded in the VOWEL app as well. But feel free to give us a call, send us an email if you would like to call and give us a hypothetical about your client's situation. We're more than happy to assist you. With Lotus Legal Clinic, as we mentioned in the beginning, we provide free legal services to victims of sexual violence and both sex and labor trafficking. We do not have income restrictions, and we assist victims with restraining orders, crime victim compensation, immigration, criminal background issues, privacy related to victimization, and also victims' rights in pending criminal prosecution or investigation. So if they are having issues with enforcing, their rights as a victim, we do have staff attorneys that assist with that. Most of our referral forms come directly to me, and I will follow up either with the individual, or if the advocate submits the referral form on their behalf, I'll connect with the advocate before I communicate with the victim on the case. And if we also assist with, you're fine. In case if you have a client that is hesitant and fears about the reporting process, we also do speak with victims and provide them with guidance. So if you do have a client in that realm, feel free to let us know, and we can definitely help.
And our contact information is on this slide. So this whole slide deck will be uploaded to Whova. But now we can turn to questions. So there are a couple questions in the chat. And I'll leave it on our contact information. But so the first question is, how does Marcy's Law affect discovery in family cases? So I am typing out a response, but I will just say briefly that the 9:55 a.m. session in this same track, the attorney's track, is addressing how victims' rights in kind of interplays with different legal issues. But specifically, there is a provision. It is under Wisconsin Constitution, Article 1, Section 9M, sub 2L. I want to say that basically a victim can refuse discovery or deposition requests made by the accused or by the defendant or someone on behalf of the defendant. And that isn't limited to the criminal case. Again, this will be talked about more in the next session, but our position is that yes, that right does exist. Typically, though, we kind of see it in the way that it is used more abusively as, a way to either harass the victim or try to get information on them that they can't otherwise access because they're not allowed to have contact with the victim. So thinking about it in that context specifically. I don't know if either Erica or Avi, you have other thoughts on that? Oh, okay. And then do you help with crime victim compensation denial appeals? I mean, in theory, we could. That's not something that we have helped with in the past, but in theory, yes. I don't know about Lotus.
Yeah, I would say the same for Lotus. It's not something we've done in the past either. But again, in theory, it's something that we could look at.
Okay. And then another question that we got ahead of time is how can prosecutors collaborate with victim rights attorneys?
Should I could start.
I was gonna say, yeah, Erica, if you wanted to start.
Sure. I mean, I think first and foremost, it's just being open to communicating and keeping that flow of information open or between us. I think it's helpful when victims do have counsel, because that is a constant communicator, and it's just easier, I think, to get updates and to also share concerns. And there are times, I think, when prosecutors find that really beneficial as well, because it does, again, take a load off the prosecutor as well. If we say, we can explain this process to the victim, we can talk about some of the things that, like the process, what the process is, and then also talking to our clients about what their concerns are, what they're thinking about, and just kind of we're then trying to work collaboratively with the DA themselves. And I really think the bottom line is just communication, and how that really helps, I think, the process move forward in a better fashion for all involved. So that would be my input right now.
Yeah, I would echo that and just say that, yes, communication is definitely key. And I think the biggest thing I think about with victims' rights, just generally, and thinking about some sessions I've attended in the past with, DA's offices and things like that, is sort of the concern about their job being made more difficult by victims' rights. And I hope that we are starting to see it more as an opportunity for victims to have some of their own autonomy in this process, and have them really be separate from the DA. So the DA isn't trying, especially having a victims' rights attorney, isn't trying to balance kind of their own obligations as the prosecutor, but also what the victim needs are, and trying, like Erica said, trying to explain the processes, trying to, if the victim wants to ask for something, trying to either ask for them on their behalf or figure out what the victim could do about that. But really having the victim with their own attorney can be a good way of kind of sometimes lessening the load of the prosecutor, sometimes making it less awkward for the prosecutor when they don't agree with the victim. I've had cases where my client wants to change the bond conditions to allow contact with the defendant because they have children together. And the DA, I've had issues where the DA has not been on board with that. So, working with the defense sometimes is necessary too. But I think not seeing it as a threat, but seeing it as an opportunity for victims to have their own voice and to have their own autonomy throughout the process, I think is an important sort of reframing of victims' rights and victims' rights attorneys. Something else, a question about how can members of the system address historical oppression and discomfort with the system, particularly discomfort with law enforcement? And I will just remind everybody before we answer that, that if you have questions, please use the Q&A function. Sorry, but loaded question of, how can you help somebody feel more comfortable?
I'll take a stab at it, and then really welcome the two of you to jump in at any point too. But I think one of the things that's helpful is incorporating for all of us the voices of people with lived experiences who have experienced who've experienced traumas that are similar to a client you're working with, but also have lived experiences with working and reporting to law enforcement, maybe even seeing the prosecution of their perpetrator through to the end, and having that person and paying that person as a consultant to provide that support or whatever that might look like. But I think that is one way that I think better will educate all of us is talking and really listening to people that have lived experiences through this. And I think the other piece of it is just, again, more training, more opportunities to look within ourselves and our organizations and how we're approaching this work and how we're recognizing that racism does play a role in our clients' experiences. And I really think then there are a lot of great tools out there that I think, all of us can utilize. But part of it's just like making that a priority as something that is important to your organization to do. So that's kind of my input.
I guess I have I don't know if it's not controversial, but I think about sometimes in response to the Black Lives Matter movement, a lot of, Blue Lives Matter came out, or Back the Blue, that kind of response, which I personally believe is largely insensitive to the spirit of the Black Lives Matter movement, in the sense that, there is this systemic oppression and history with law enforcement that has resulted in the deaths of many people of color, especially Black people. So thinking about what you have in your office, what you have to create a safe space. I know personally, I have seen sort of the Back the Blue, Blue Lives Matter flags at certain victim witness offices or DA's offices, which I understand you're working with law enforcement, and that relationship is important. But for a victim who is coming in who has a history of difficulty or discomfort with law enforcement, having that kind of message, even if you don't intend it to be negative for them, it can be uncomfortable and it can be difficult for them to feel like they are in a safe and welcoming space. So I think, just being cognizant of what you have in your office and what that could be communicating to the people who are coming in and trying to access help. That would be my 2 cents on that. I did want to talk about our poll. I think we got 37 responses. So thank you all for responding to that. I think, so the question was, how do you experience vicarious trauma, or how does trauma exposure manifest in your life? The most common responses, or the most common manifestations, I guess you could say, would be helplessness, hopelessness, and feeling like you can never do enough, which honestly, same. Chronic exhaustion and saturated nervous system, lack of presence, deliberate avoidance, and cognitive overload. And then anger and cynicism would be the most common ones, although there's kind of a smattering all over the board on that one. But I think I'm not surprised, because I think that those are commonly, realizing it too, that it is, for me at least, that realizing that, oh, this is because I'm like, my day is constantly flooded with the trauma of other people. Mm-hmm. And I'm not, that there are reasons behind it. So I don't know, Erica, if you wanted to talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, I think, this is very interesting. And I think that's, again, this is a great step to be recognizing that these are our responses to working with people that have been trauma affected and are continuing to be trauma affected, and knowing that we are too, is acknowledging that and being aware of it is the first step to looking at ways we can adapt, and ways that we can reach out and search for things that are going to bring us back to a healthy place, in a place where we are processing that internal trauma in a positive way. And I think that's actually probably should be part of our jobs, right? Is to figure that out, so that, and hopefully, we've talked about some ways to do that, and hopefully that's helpful for everyone that is this webinar today, to think about the options that might be available to you in those different areas, the support systems, the looking at things to do that bring you joy outside of your work, and recognizing that and valuing that, instead of valuing, oh, I'm fine, I'm tough, I can do this because that's what I'm supposed to do. So
Yeah.
It's very important for everyone to find different outlets. For example, me as a paralegal and the interpreter, it's can be challenging, but it helps me with debriefing after a brief phone call or an interview with a client. So it is it's challenging working with survivors, but we definitely have to find, and having our own boundaries set when we're working with survivors as well.
Yeah. I think that's a good reminder that, our responses to trauma are not a moral failing. It's something that is expected and that we should feel comfortable addressing in getting help for. It does look like we are at the end of our time, but I would encourage everyone to make sure to check out our materials. And then also I would ask, sorry, Lotus, people are asking for you to do more work. But your survivor empowerment programs, I'm wondering if you could just make sure that whatever in your materials that you upload to Whova, that you include that information as well.
Definitely.
I think that would be, I'd be interested in learning more about it personally. So I'm thinking at least maybe one other person is out there thinking the same thing. So
definitely.
Thank you all so much for attending our session today. Again, our contact information is on this slide, and we will be uploading our slide deck to Whova, so please check that out. After the session is recorded, and then the recording will be on and available on Whova for 3 months after the conference has concluded. So please make sure to, if you haven't seen some of the sessions that you might be interested in, you can go back and watch some of those. And then the next session starts at 9:55. So we have a little bit of a break here. So thank you so much to Erica and Avi.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Megan.
Thank you, Megan.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.